So I've been talking to you about my quest, my determination to move someplace better, and how I thought maybe I'd been doing that when I moved to South Beach back in 607, no, 06, the fall of 2006. And I wanted to, therefore, finish that up. Obviously, I was telling you, well, not obviously. Funny how sometimes we inject words in that aren't necessary to be injected. Part of the early morning experience. It's not quite 7 o'clock yet this morning, but I did want to make sure that I was able to get this vlog done with enough space to not feel as though I was in a hurry. So that's why I'm doing it now, not yet fully awake perhaps, and requiring a tremendous deal of coffee. Not a tremendous deal of coffee. Again, that would be an exaggeration. So, one of the most important elements, see, complexity is interesting. When things are really complex, it's hard to decide which aspect of something you want to start with. And, you try to look at fundamentals and build your way up. Philosophically speaking, right? From epistemology to aesthetics, one might say. With respect to this move to South Beach, one of the most important aspects of it is that it was one of the most unique moves I've ever made. Because unlike my move to Union to go to Kean University, right? I did that. Much of that was just a very automated, you're supposed to go to college, so I went to college. I went to Fort Myers at Florida Gulf Coast University. You're supposed to stay in college, but okay, I'll try to go to college somewhere that, where I think I would find a little bit more happiness. But going to South Beach was not, in any respect, something I perceived as something I was supposed to do according to anybody who was a guide in my life, right? My parents weren't advocates of the move. Nobody advised me that I ought to make the move. It was inherently my rejection of the university experience, above and beyond all other aspects of it. I told you that I had wanted to move to England and that I was planning to do that. And that fell through, and there was a question of this romantic relationship, since we had both rejected that particular college, and she stayed in South Beach where she lived, and I decided if we were going to break up and not go to England together, I was at least going to go have some adventure and try to make this romantic relationship work. So I moved there. But this was a drastically different move, just a drastically different life decision than any other life decision I'd made. So I think of it in a lot of ways as probably my first significantly philosophical move. Again, most inherently, beyond all of the other context I offered you, psychological, philosophical, etc., it was this rejection of college and the way that I was perceived to the notion of like, well, you're supposed to go to college and do this and you're supposed to do that. It was a total rejection of the supposed to do anything, right? Very Nietzschean before Nietzsche was introduced to me, really, so to speak, as I was telling you about before. Part of understanding who I was and how I ended up there, and I began to scratch the surface of this in the last video, is also understanding the people who really inspired me and were significant in shaping my views. See, one of the interesting things about what I would call sort of the pre-philosophy phase of my life, pre-Nietzsche, everything before I was about 21, there were all these philosophical implications, but I wasn't getting my philosophical guidance from people we think of as conventional philosophers per se, but I treated them with I processed them and interpreted them and contemplated them as people with philosophical advice to offer, if that could make any sense to you. And this goes all the way back to when I was about 9 or 10 years old, and I first really began conceptualizing myself as an artist. So you must understand the artist side of me to understand how it is that I came to end up really living in South Beach, because the whole point underlying all of the more basic fundamental philosophical ideas is this idea that at the end of the day, I perceived myself, specifically at this time, as the starving artist, living the dream of the starving artist experience, who embraced all of these sort of implicit philosophical notions and was trying to live by them and express them in his artwork. So you have to understand how I evolved in the artistic sense to understand how it came to be that I end up there. So this has to go all the way back to when I was in 4th grade, and that was about the time that I can remember discovering the world of acting. Now, there wasn't I don't remember a particular time. Maybe my mother does. I don't remember like a particular moment when I said, oh yes, I want to be an actor. I don't know how exactly it happened. I can tell you, and I mentioned this earlier, that part of understanding how I became who I was how I came to conceptualize romantic love, right? And that part of that was actually inspired by the movie Grease. Another thing that happened when I saw the movie Grease was I became enamored. I became very fascinated with the acting of John Travolta. He had this charisma, I think is the best way to put it. He had this charisma, and he just exuded a certain kind of poise and coolness, and I just had this interest in how to be like that on camera. And he played all these interesting characters as I would begin to explore his career. Within a year, I would say. So I really got into John Travolta in 4th grade. So it was about 10. By the time I was in 5th grade, by the time I was about 11 then, I had come to know just about everything there was to know about him as someone who, doesn't know him personally. I don't mean that in a creepy way. I just mean I was a major fan, so to speak. I watched all of his movies. My parents let me even watch the rated R movies. So that's how I got introduced to Saturday Night Fever and eventually the Bee Gees. And I'll get to the Bee Gees in a second. So John Travolta opens up this world to me of this idea of being a movie star, a movie actor, and it becomes my first major dream in life. And it's interesting because as I think of myself now, movies and TV doesn't really interest me. I mean, this is a video blog, and you could argue that there is therefore like a movie TV element to this, but I see this as I don't know if you're listening to this that entertainment is the thing that you're necessarily going for. I like to think that this is a integration of philosophy and art, and perhaps some degree of, the kind of thing you might associate with some aspects of talk radio. I don't know. If you ask me how do I conceptualize this video blog at this point in time, 51 vlogs on, by the way. Congratulations to me. I reached 50 yesterday. Vlog number 50. So that's an exciting number. 50 is a great number. We think of it as like half of 100 is like half of a century. There's this feel of longevity. Longevity is something that quite interests me. It's another topic for another time, unless I get into something like Proust today. I don't know that I will. This whole talking thing for me has a jazz-like element to it, in that while I have a guideline, you never know just where it might go, because I don't like a script. I like to just talk naturally, and it's another aesthetic idea we'll get to another time. John Travolta, part of it is the characters that he plays that interests me. Danny Zuko in Grease, all the girls like him, and I wanted to be that guy that all the girls liked. That was very similar in Saturday Night Fever, but he could also dance. So I do think that there was this relationship between the character he portrayed in these movies, this guy that all the girls like, that's perceived by his guy friends as super cool. I think that my initial interest in him, I think it would be logical to guess that had to have an influencing role in how that led to this interest in movie acting. But I really delved into it, and I started exploring the world of actors, getting into, at that time, it would have been Tom Hanks, Dustin Hoffman, Al Pacino. I got into Marlon Brando. I got into James Woods. I got into Meryl Streep. Just to name a few. Donald Sutherland. I enjoy watching Kiefer Sutherland now on Designated Survivor. He's a great actor in his own right. So I become determined to become a movie star. And this is part of even how I can associate with my detachment from school at that time, and why I didn't really do so good at it, because I was always fantasizing about being in the movies. I would spend all day wondering, what would it be like to be on the set, playing a character? It was just the ultimate dream for me. And an amazing thing happened around the time 5th or into 6th grade, when my father gave me his camcorder. And I started making movies. I wrote them. Sometimes I did one-man movies. Sometimes the few friends I had, we would work together, and somebody would write something, and another person would direct it, and another person would make sure that the production was coordinated, and somebody else would do some of the acting, or, we would do different aspects of it. And so I got to sort of live out this, fantasy of pretending I was this famous, important actor, and we would make these movies. And this kept me going. We did this probably for good. This is something we did from about 5th grade to freshman, maybe sophomore year of high school. So you're talking about 5th grade to 8th grade, right? 5th grade, 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade, 4, 6. Talking about, I know I can't do math when I'm thinking out loud and still waking up, etc. Whatevs, as the young people like to say. Well, do the young people even like to say that anymore? That's a weird thing with getting older and not working with young cashiers anymore. But now college students at the tutoring center, and not hearing them as much in their vernacular. You don't know anymore what the young folks are saying. So about 6 years of really in-depth obsession with this idea of becoming a movie star, and also writing movies as well. It was the sort of 2 things I wanted to do. 3 things, really. I wanted to write movies, I wanted to star in movies, and I wanted to produce movies. And that became my sense of identity. I was the guy who was going to be a famous actor one day. And it was cut and dry. It was that simple for me initially. Went to a performing arts summer camp. That's how I met the great Tim Moran, one of my best friends. That's how I met the great acting teacher and actor Dan Spluto. I met some amazing people because I wanted to be a movie star, and was able to embrace my inner artist self, if you will. But another interesting thing is happening by the time I'm about 13, 14, so though I'm still in the prime of my interest in becoming a movie star, I become exposed to the Bee Gees. The impact the Bee Gees have had on my life is such that I will have to dedicate another number of video blogs just dedicated to the Bee Gees. That's how profound the impact of the Bee Gees has been on me. As you might guess if you know a thing about Saturday Night Fever, so I was first exposed to the Bee Gees when I was in 4th grade. I think it was 4th grade, maybe 5th grade. And I saw the movie Saturday Night Fever for the first time, and I didn't really think too much of it. I liked watching the movie, though, so I watched Saturday Night Fever quite a number of times and really studied Travolta's experience and would hear the Bee Gees in the background, not really thinking much of them. Then one Christmas, and it was probably the Christmas I was in 6th grade, I want to say, so it was probably 12. And for Christmas, my brother gave me the soundtrack to Saturday Night Fever. Fine, that's a nice gift. I didn't think much of it, but I would listen to the first couple of tracks in particular. And it was then that, for whatever reason, the music of the Bee Gees resonated with me in a way that nothing else in the world was resonating with me. Their lyrics were extraordinarily romantic. And I was a hopeless romantic. We've talked about that before, that I had these ideas of love. And I told you that even later, that the Bee Gees would be a part of that. I didn't delve into it, though. The Bee Gees is such a loaded topic and is probably best served in understanding myself more in terms of aesthetics than merely ideas of romantic love, though they definitely have a lot to do with how I conceptualize romantic love, perhaps still to this day. But I come to admire the Bee Gees because almost all of their songs are about romantic love, and even if they are very sad songs, where for some inexplicable reason the guy is hopelessly abandoned by the woman, and we don't know why, their songs are never really angry or mean-spirited. They're always very, they're these, like, for lack of a better word, like these sweetheart kind of guys, these softy kind of guys, these deeply romantic kind of guys. And that's the kind of person I wanted to be. And so I identified with, if you're to think about sort of art, and art as projecting philosophical values, or like Ayn Rand talks about in The Fountainhead, or Atlas Shrugged, and trying to project her idea of like the ideal man or something. Interpreting the Bee Gees as projecting values. This was really my first exposure to art in a deeply intellectual way, because while it was Travolta and acting that had me wanting to be an artist and sort of really conceptualizing art, understanding it as values which a person could relate with didn't come until the Bee Gees. And I'm listening to these song lyrics and I'm thinking, like, yeah, you take the words literally out of my mouth. And so I began at about 13 years old, deeply inspired by the Bee Gees, writing my own song lyrics and poetry, and still not I don't know how seriously I took myself with respect to notions of poetry. I don't know when notions of poetry really hit me. I was really more smitten by the idea of song lyrics, and sometimes I thought of song lyrics as poetry, sometimes I didn't. But then, and I believe that I referenced this in the introductory essay to the public comment website, I got exposed to J.D. Salinger, and I start listening to Alanis Morissette more closely. Alanis Morissette is a musician I'm exposed to because my older brother was into her, and I would hear the music, but I wouldn't think of it in a way like I was initially thinking of the Bee Gees. That is to say, not really thinking about it in an artistic, deeply personal sense. So, at 16, at this point I'm an avid collector of all Bee Gees music, and I've come to know almost all 50 years worth of their career. And so, and I really studied it. It really, in a way, it's kind of disappointing, the credit you can't get for things that you do that don't necessarily have an immediate relevance to school, but when you put a sort of academic passion to it. You see, I didn't really have a lot of friends, so I didn't really have much of a so-called life when I was a teenager. So most of my time was spent listening to the Bee Gees songs over and over and over again. I would study the melody. I would study the way the melody made me feel. I would study the tones and the moods of the lyrics, and I would try to emulate them and write my own songs and write my own melodies and things. Alanis Morissette and J.D. Salinger really shake me up conceptualizing writing. So I really start to experience this transition from sense of self as interested in movie acting to suddenly getting very interested in writing. And it really starts with J.D. So if Bee Gees get me writing poetry as sort of something to do, then J.D. Salinger's narrative was such that he was just talking directly to his reader. This fascinated me because it sort of contradicted other notions of literature that had been exposed to throughout my entire life. The literature was always, I mean, for lack of better words, always came across to me as kind of pretentious, or needing to color the language in such a way that there was supposed to be some mystery as to what somebody meant. There was something like it was up there. You couldn't quite reach it. It was something you were to be tested on, and there was like something you weren't supposed to get about it, or that was supposed to be very challenging about it. And so I guess you could say like a criticism maybe you might offer of J.D. Salinger is that he doesn't feel on the surface like a challenge to read. But to me, it was just the fact that there was this person getting real with his reader, being real with his reader, and talking openly and in a way that was uninhibited and, again, real, and just talking to as opposed to talking at or writing at. You could say there was a sort of like stream of consciousness style to it, or feel to it. And it was around that same time that I really started listening more closely to the lyrics of Alanis Morissette too. And it was her second major album. It's the one with the single Thank You in it. And all of her songs, I think every single song on that album doesn't rhyme. I thought, whoa, she's like breaking the rules of how I sort of understand the song to be. And all of a sudden, I'm experimenting with different kinds of writing. I start writing novellas, and I start writing free verse poetry, and getting pretty into just different aspects of writing. And I begin to understand myself more as a writer, sometimes a fiction writer, sometimes a poet. Sometimes I'm still writing screenplays, and would keep making movies till I was about 16. So that would keep going, and so I was sort of like sometimes a poet and sometimes an actor, or maybe I was both. Now, everything changes again by the time I'm 18 and going to Kane University. At that point, passionate though I am about poetry and theory, I never really reached so much beyond the song lyricists. Though I do study, at this point in my life, 17, 18, really delving into the lyrics of songs. Creed, I mean, from like a wide range of artists. Creed and your Nickelback and your hard rock lyricists, to your classic rock lyricists like the Rolling Stones, to country music, the Rascal Flatts, to contemporary pop music like Maroon 5. And I'm just trying to really listen very closely to lyrics and ask like how would that inform me as a lyric writer. And I know I took out like a Walt Whitman book and a Sharon Olds book at the high school library, and was becoming exposed to this idea of just writing to people in a way that was, number one, very direct and clear, and number two, like not really academic, or in a way that where you write something that people don't understand. These became sort of like ideals that were resonating with me in my concept of self as an artist. But then something changes here, and that is a very fateful night. The night I was supposed to go to my prom. I chose not to. I chose instead to hang out with the great writer Jenna Rosano, and we went to the bookstore. We went to Barnes & Noble and hung out. We listened to Beatles songs, and then we just perused the poetry section at the bookstore and contemplated it and talked about it. And so there I was exposed to Charles Bukowski, and just like that, my entire world changed in a majorly profound way. Shook up everything. Bukowski said whatever he wanted to say, and he was also very talkative in the sense of, like, he's always writing. He was very prolific, and he would use words that I was shocked to see in poetry. I don't feel need to repeat now, but writing very bluntly about sex, and writing about his poverty, and writing about his alcoholism and his anger, and he was just a very revealing guy. And I found this fascinating because he was A, revealing, B, very clear and easy to understand, but he was also very reflective, and I was just motivated. He was easy to read, and he was just all these wonderful things, and so real, and not academic, but yet not. It wasn't as if he was anti-artistic. And I started emulating him, and I started writing very much describing exactly what I was thinking and feeling and where I was, and trying to be very open and honest, and wanting to delve really deep into the atheism that I had, or want to write about, like, sex and masturbation, and be very blunt. I wanted to be as blunt as I could and describe the scenery of wherever I was, though I was never really good at describing scenery. And I began to consume and, like, just literally inhale Bukowski poetry. If I couldn't afford his book, I would take it out of the library. And then what came Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac and the Beats. And this is another topic that really deserves its own vlog, or a number of vlogs, because just like Travolta and the Bee Gees are very significant in moving me towards things, Travolta with acting and the Bee Gees with poetry and song and music and deeper thoughts of art and even certain philosophical ideas like love, and they were influential, I think, in both my notions of love and fate. The Beats shake things up a little bit more than Bukowski. I suppose it has to start more with Ginsberg than Kerouac, because Ginsberg was an atheist, and I was able to relate to that very much so. Ginsberg was the first poet I ever read who was unabashedly and explicitly atheistic, and that was really significant because all my life being an atheist had been sort of a lonely vocation. It was this philosophical idea that was one of the few staunch philosophical notions I had in my mind consciously in my adolescence, because even if I was sort of a romantic and a fatalist, I wasn't able to articulate it with as much intensity and intellectualism or pseudo-intellectualism as I could atheism in my teenage years. And moreover, the thing is that everybody thought I was weird for being an atheist. It was strange. I mean, it's strange now because actually a lot of people I know are either agnostic or atheist. But when I was in high school and I had taken this, this is just to really illustrate it for you, I was taking this current events class, or it was a history class, but we had, I think, current events Fridays or something like that. And we all had a current events project we were supposed to do, and I did current events and atheism, and got up in front of the class and said, "I'm an atheist," and everybody was shocked. Oh my God. One guy came up to me, "Wow, you're so brave to, I can't believe you had the guts to say that." It was strange because I can't say I grew up in a very, like, explicitly, deeply, actively Christian community either. But I think it was that people just identified as Christians, even if they didn't really delve into their Christianity. I mean, I had friends who were deeply, deeply, deeply Christian, and I've got an earlier vlog on that you can watch, where I talk about that in much more detail. But I had no exposure through my adolescence really to any kind of atheistic thinkers. Atheism perhaps being more of a philosophy thing, and me thinking that philosophy was something I could never even begin to touch. I was just an actor and a poet, and philosophy was all the way up there. So my atheism was just very almost more me in a personal way than something very philosophical or consciously about philosophy. It was just, to me, it just was like, yeah, there's no God, it is what it is. I didn't think of it in terms of the academic offshoots that might exist because of that idea. It was just very straightforward for me as a sort of fundamental ideological viewpoint. But then there's Allen Ginsberg, unabashedly atheistic, and so you have to understand that when you're not exposed to a lot of people with a value or viewpoint that you hold very intensely, that you can then become very, I think, vulnerable to becoming influenced by other views that person has. And so I became obsessed with Ginsberg, and then obsessed with his buddy Jack Kerouac and all of the beats and the beat movement. And this was profound in shaking up my philosophical thinking, because whereas if you read Bukowski is sort of very just direct and mostly a very tangible writer. I don't want to say quite concrete, because he did go into the abstract, but I would say that Bukowski, even if some of his ideas were irrational, he didn't strike me as a kind of writer who embraced flamboyant irrationality, being two different things. You could be irrational because you just have sort of contradictory ideas, and therefore are acting in irrational ways, but not embrace the sort of deeply embedded irrationalism. So Bukowski kind of had a very, I think there's something about him that strives for a certain kind of objectivity. If you look at his writing, he tries to be very precise and exact, I think, in what he's telling you and such. But with Ginsberg and Kerouac and then William S. Burroughs and the gang, poetry becomes inherently philosophical in its utter embrace of flamboyant irrationalism. There are times reading Ginsberg when I thought, wow, he must be stoned out of his mind. That was never really the case with Bukowski. With Bukowski, maybe he was drunk, and you associate drunkenness more with just being a little slower, maybe, and more uninhibited. But with, Ginsberg, you felt like these people were doing more than smoking pot, even. You felt that these people were tripping out, like it was, the things they wrote were so difficult at times to understand, and you thought it was because they must be in this, I thought it must be because they were in these altered states of consciousness, and they were just deeply irrational. And there was this fascination they had with madness, was something I didn't get from Bukowski. So I almost have these two sort of competing impulses. One is this sort of strict, sort of objective or striving towards objective kind of writing, with its own irrational stains, and contradictory ideas. Bukowski was an alcoholic, and he was very angry and negative, but he doesn't get into weird, from my memory of his poetry, it's not something I really read so much anymore, But from my memory of him, he never goes quite into the embrace of outright irrational principles and such. But with Ginsberg and Kerouac, the way Kerouac put it in one of his poems, I think he uses the phrase "butte magic of ignorance," I think is the thing that he says. And with Ginsberg, right, that classic first line of Howl, "I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness." And that first half of the poem, the first half of that line, "I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed," it's like I just didn't pay attention to the destroyed part. But I just thought, the best minds of my generation, I heard that and thought, oh, okay. So whoever Ginsberg is talking about now, the world he's describing, these must be the geniuses of the world. So I start delving into Howl, which is this 20-plus minute poem. And, it's a poem that, it's the first poem I think I ever actually listened to. Believe it or not, contrary to most conceptions of how to experience poetry, I've always preferred reading it. But Howl, I enjoyed listening to, and I think you could download it off of like LimeWire or one of those Napster or one of those things. And it was a poem you could listen to and really experience the intensity of. And he illustrates this world of drugs and sex and depression and bearing out your soul and all these intense things. And your mind begins to swirl. My mind begins to swirl over Ginsberg and Kerouac. And I guess this has got to be sort of a part 2 thing, because there's still more to say. But now, once we touch on an understanding of the beats, and I'll just leave you with this, Kerouac's On the Road. It was Jack Kerouac's On the Road that made me want to drop out of college. It was Jack Kerouac's On the Road that made me feel at my most anti-academic, or made me feel most consciously anti-academic for the first time. Because even if I sort of hated school and thought like it's this thing you need to do, with Kerouac, to quote Eminem, "Fuck school, I'm too cool to go back. Show me the mic, show me where the motherfucking studio's at," right? That's how I felt, for lack of better words. I wanted to hitchhike and travel the country like Kerouac did, and I didn't need school to teach me how to do that, I thought. And this begins to, so it's really the thinking of these beat poets that start to move me into the mentality that would take me over by the time I moved to South Beach. And it's just impossible to fully, in my opinion, appreciate who I am there, why I'm there, and how I experience living there without understanding how I get to this interest in the beat poets and find myself so susceptible to their ways of thinking, and how that leads me to certain other artists and their ways of thinking as well because of my interest in the beat. So understanding this development and evolution of interest in particular artists is crucial to this particular story. So I will leave it there. I want to thank you so much for your time. I look forward to chatting with you tomorrow. It will be Independence Day. And I'll probably say a thing about that. That's a complex thing to wrap one's mind around, as I'm a globalist, not a nationalist. So I do have struggles with what it means to be an American versus what it means to be a human, and what it means to appreciate unique ideals that the United States might theoretically stand for versus ideals that reach towards something more universal and global. It's another conversation. Thank you so much. I'll chat with you again soon. Bye.